podcast.
Welcome to Our Weird World. I'm your host, John Henson, and it's a new month, and it is also back to the thing that we normally do at the start of a month, and that is, I think the cat needs to pee. Hang on a second. Let me pause the episode and open the litter box. Again, I could have just not recorded any of that bit. I was 30 seconds into the episode. I could have just said, oh, let me take care of this for the kitty real quick. And then I can just re-record the intro. But no, it was a great excuse to throw in some new hold music anytime I just want to pause the episode and go take care of some stuff. He is now done. Like, pretty much that entire time that music was playing, Kitty was in there, I don't know, pinching one off or something. I don't know. But, again, as with the other music in the show, totally AI generated. Like, do you not? That makes me feel like I am sitting outside of a waiting room in a Belk in the 90s as my mom tries on 8 outfits that she never even ends up buying. Like, what were we even? That's how bored housewives were in the 90s. You just go to the mall and try on outfits for hours. Spend a whole afternoon. Bore your child to tears sitting in just the bathing fluorescent lights. Just as she comes out, tries on different things. She's never going to wear. She's not going to wear them to church. And she doesn't have a job. Where else is she going? Because it's not like your parents have date nights in Goldsboro where there's like one fancy restaurant, Phalaris, that doesn't even exist anymore. Shout out to Phalaris, where my parents were trying to have a date night one night on Mother's Day weekend, and then my friend hauled off and bashed a golf club into my skull and sent me to the emergency room. And his parents had to call Phalaris because that's what you used to have to do. You used to have to tell your friend's parents where you're going to be in case of an emergency. They couldn't just call you a random number, couldn't just call your cell phone and have access to you wherever you are. You had to know where you're going to be and at what time. And so the wait staff at Phalaris had to go up to my parents while they're eating their bread or whatever and be like, hey, there's been an accident. Your son's in the hospital. And then I bled on the one nice dress my mother had. So that, I don't know why I told you any of that. Again, here's the thing. A great podcast host would not release any of this. I would just re-record. If I were good at this, I would just re-record everything. This last 4 minutes has not been enriching to anyone at all whatsoever. I saw the cat. He's gonna probably have the zoomies because he probably made a poopsies, and that's fine. It's the Weird Fun Bag. We're gonna segue back into the show. It is the Weird Fun Bag. What edition is it? As I pull my notes back up and reveal even more unprofessionalism and lack of preparedness. It is the 13th edition of the Weird Fun Bag. We're looking at the stories of Richard Parker, Albert Johnson, and our first story will be of Phalaris.
Story time. Story time. Story time?
here's the thing, you guys. Like, I say this is a terrible show. This is a really good show. All right. Who else is giving this kind of personality and energy and bringing you, who's really helping you learn about things that make you go, oh, and that's it. That's all you need in this life sometimes. You think Rogan's doing that? No. You think my favorite murder and last podcast on the, we are like an NPR show. We like to talk very smooth and soothing and very relaxing. Blah. Gross. No. This show brings energy and sometimes information. And I think that's pretty sweet. And I think it's really good. And I think more people should listen to it because I think they would find it very valuable and entertaining. Are more people going to listen to it? No. Why? Because you don't tell your friends. You know how I tell you at the end of every show to tell your friends? You ain't done it on account of the downloads have kind of plateaued recently. And that's fine. I still appreciate you. But you know, you don't have to just keep this to yourself. Is all I'm saying. All right? Because look, I want to sell you guys, I don't know, Adam and Eve codes or Blue Chews or Casper mattresses or whatever kind of green powder super vitamin smoothie stuffs they're hawking now. Whatever, man. I want to do that stuff. It seems like fun. But anyway, what is wrong with me today? I'm not even, it's just the morning. That's all it is. Our first story, going all the way back to 554 BC, 2 weeks in a row, going back into the before times. Phalaris was the ruler of the Sicilian city of Agrigento for roughly about 16 years. He made sure that the city had plenty of fresh water. He improved the infrastructure as much as you can in the BC times. And he constructed several beautiful bridges and buildings around the city. He even built a massive wall to keep the Mexicans out. No, he didn't. Sicily is an island. They don't need that. But here's the thing. Like, the people of Agrigento loved him so much that they elected him general and just gave him absolute power over everything. That is every politician's wet dream, to be so adored by everyone that they just say, man, you do whatever you want. You rule over everything. And now, granted, this is what history says. Maybe Phalaris was not necessarily that good of a person. And maybe he just kind of rewrote the history books himself to make it seem like everybody loved him, when in reality, maybe he just took over absolute rule of everything by force. Anyway, Phalaris, however, he took this election to mean that he was ruler over the entire island and subsequently went mad with power, which apparently included eating babies. That is what the history books say. So, I mean, look, if he rewrote the part about everyone loving him and making him absolute ruler, why would he also not kind of erase that part about eating babies? So I don't know. Maybe everything's on the up and up. But again, that wasn't enough. It didn't matter that he ruled over the entire island or that he was universally loved, allegedly, or that, you know, he had all the babies he could ever want to eat, allegedly. He needed, as many rulers back then did, needed to create a maniacal kind of device to torture people. So Phalaris found a Greek man named Phalaris to construct a brazen bull, which was basically this torture device originally designed in ancient Greece that was basically like a human oven. In a short time, Phalaris presented this magnificent bull to Phalaris, complete with the most advanced technology of the time. The head of this bull contained a complex system of tunes and stops that, basically like an organ, that made the screams of whatever poor soul was thrown inside the bull sound like the bull was like, whatever sound bulls make, right? I actually don't know. Bulls don't moo. They like grunt and snort and like, or whatever. I don't know, man. Whatever. Don't get your judgment off your face right now. You don't know what a bull sounds like. All right? Finn has like toys that do animal sounds. Guess what? There's no bulls in them. All right? Like it's a cow, like a white and black cow that goes moo. And I get it. Bulls are just dude cows, but bulls don't moo. All right? I think we can all agree on that. Bulls do not moo. I don't know what they do. They don't moo. It's too much rhyming. We're going to move on. Smoke, and back to this brazen bull, smoke would also come out of the nose and mouth in clouds of incense that got burned from within it. Bones of the charred victims, once they were done, were then collected in a single area where they could be removed, bleached, and then made into jewelry. So, Perillos, upon presenting this brazen bull to Phalaris, said, quote, "Screams will come to you through the pipes as the tenderest, most pathetic, most melodious of bellowings." And Phalaris was pleased with that because he's a psychopath. And then feeling cocky, Perillos then asked for a reward for creating such a magnificent state-of-the-art torture device. And Phalaris thought that was the dumbest idea ever, but kindly then asked Perillos to test out the bull's sound system just to kind of make sure that everything was working the way it was supposed to. Because again, this is very primitive times. You can't just introduce new technology and expect it to work. So Perillos, for some unknown reason, decides to use himself as the test subject and locks himself inside the bull. And at that point, Phalaris lit a fire underneath the bull and began roasting Perillos alive. By all accounts, though, the bull's sound system worked like a charm. All right, just Perillos's screams did sound just like whatever. Again, whatever a bull sounds like. However, before Perillos died inside the bull, Phalaris took him out. But then, rather giving Perillos his payment for creating the bull, Phalaris marched Perillos to the top of a hill and just threw him off of a cliff, killing him. No one actually knows how many people Phalaris ended up killing inside the brazen bull, but he was eventually overthrown from power in 554 BC by Telemachus and then roasted alive inside of his own torture chamber. So, justice. Our next story here, crazy coincidence here. In 1838, Edgar Allan Poe published his only novel, The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket. Did you know that Edgar Allan Poe only published one book? Everything else was like short stories and poems, not books. That was news to me. Granted, I'm not like one of those emo goth dorks who just like idolize Edgar Allan Poe. Like, he was a writer. Cool. He did some stuff. Great. Like, he's just one of, and I say this as a writer, like, we're not special. I'm not, for sure. But like, his stuff was good. It's not good enough to make it your entire personality. All right. Anyway, in this book, The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket, the crew of a ship called Grampus gets shipwrecked, and the crew is forced to draw straws to figure out who will be sacrificed to be eaten. Classic Poe, right? A character named Richard Parker drew the short straw and then was promptly stabbed to death. Now, some 50 years later, almost 50 years later, 46 years later, in 1884, Australian lawyer John Henry Want purchased the yacht, the Mignonette, and paid for it to be sailed back to Australia for its use. So, on May 19th, a crew of 4 men, Captain Edwin Stevens, Tom Dudley, Edmund Brooks, and a guy named Richard Parker, set sail from Southampton, England to Sydney. All right, so you already know where this is going. On July 5th, this ship hit strong winds as the crew was somewhere off of the coast of Africa in the middle of the South Atlantic Ocean. However, Tom Dudley felt that everything was fine and sent everyone down below the deck to rest for the night. As everyone prepared the ship for the overnight, a huge random rogue wave struck the ship so violently that it capsized and began to sink. Within 5 minutes, the Mignonette was gone. The crew They jumped onto the flimsy lifeboat that the ship had and struggled to stay afloat. They were fighting off sharks and huge waves that threatened to destroy this tiny lifeboat and drown them all. After 2 days, Dudley opened a can of turnips he had saved and shared them with the crew. And then 2 more days later, the crew came across a turtle, which they dragged aboard and slaughtered and ate. Because look, they're in full survival mode. They don't have anything else to eat, right? Well, by July 20th, the crew was completely out of food and had consistently failed to catch any kind of rainwater. Richard Parker had tried drinking the seawater, not realizing it was the last thing he should have done. And he's getting real sick. And as his condition worsened, the crew started discussing sacrificing someone so that the others could survive, but they couldn't really come to a full agreement on it. So, Tom Dudley and Captain Edwin Stevens, they eventually decided that Parker should just go ahead and die. And so Dudley stabs Parker in the neck and kills him. At least 4 days later, the crew was then rescued by a passing German ship who then returned them to England in September. Dudley and Stevens gave their statements as was required under British law following a shipping loss. And when they got to the part where they killed Parker, police actually confiscated the knife that Dudley had used. I don't know why you don't just throw that overboard. And then later that day, the 3 remaining men were arrested. Apparently no one had any idea what to do when someone was murdered at sea, and Dudley believed that the charges would be dismissed based on a lack of sea customs, international maritime law, all that kind of stuff, right? The trial lasted several weeks with both sides going back and forth over what should be done. And finally, on December 9th, Dudley and Stevens were actually charged with murder and sentenced to death. But then 3 days later, the sentence was commuted to 6 months in prison. But just a crazy coincidence that Edgar Allan Poe wrote a book about a guy who got shipwrecked and then got chosen to be sacrificed to be eaten by the crewmate, only for like the exact same thing to happen almost 50 years later in real life. It's crazy. Our final story here is of Albert Johnson, who was a roaming trapper in Canada who arrived in Fort McPherson in the Northwest Territories on July 9th, 1931. Although Johnson had plenty of money for supplies, he didn't have a trapper's license, which was the thing that he absolutely needed to have, apparently. Although he was questioned by Royal Canadian Mounted Police Constable Edgar Millen about his intentions, Johnson was allowed to live in peace in a small cabin on the banks of the Rat River several miles from the fort. Because of the depression going on at the time, many people were flooding rural Canadian forests and overrunning the native trappers to make a living. They weren't like flooding it with water. They were like literally like going there in droves and competing for natural resources, right? Well, in December of 1931, one of those trappers near the town of Aklavik filed a complaint with the police and accused Johnson of undoing his traps and hanging them in the trees. On December 26, Constable Alfred King and Special Constable Joe Bernard walked 60 miles because apparently they don't have horses, even though they're the mounted police. But they walked 60 miles to ask Johnson about these allegations. However, Johnson basically just completely ignored these guys, despite the constable's several attempts to get his attention. When King walked up to the cabin window, Johnson just covered it up. And then with no other choice, the two did basically the most Canadian thing ever and just walked back to Aklavik to obtain an official search warrant. Whatever. 5 days later, King and Bernard returned with 5 other men, hopefully with like more reliable transportation. But again, Johnson continued to ignore them. After several attempts to communicate with Johnson, King finally got impatient and tried to break the door down. Johnson was not amused by this and shot King through the door. And a fight, like apparently the fight was going to break, but they were not prepared for this fight. So the group retreated back to town. So by now, the Mounties are tired of this. They're tired of playing nice. And they organized a posse of 9 men, 42 dogs, and 20 pounds of dynamite. The group then arrived back at Johnson's cabin, lit the dynamite, and just started throwing it at the building. Just like, hey man, if you're not going to come out, we're going to blow you out. That sounds weird. So they're throwing dynamite at the building. Dynamite explodes on impact, blows the building to bits. The men then rush in to try to pull Johnson out from the rubble, likely apologizing profusely. You know how Canadians, oh, sorry, mate, we had to go and do this, you know. But Johnson, he pops out of a dugout that he had prepared to like shield himself from the explosions and all the flying debris. And he starts shooting at everyone. And then after like this weird A-team style shootout in which there's a ton of explosions, but yet no one's ever hit with any of the gunfire and no one dies, the two sides then just stared at each other in complete silence for the next 15 hours. All right. Keep in mind, Albert Johnson has not said a word to anyone at any point during this. He just stares at people. Right. And so now the two, they're just like at each other's positions and they just stand and stare at each other for 15 hours. And by 4 a.m., with the temperature at negative 40 degrees Fahrenheit, the posse is just like, all right, we're done. We're cold. And they go back to Aklavik to get more help. So after a blizzard delayed the posse's return, the group goes back to Johnson's ruined cabin on January 14th to discover that he had abandoned the area. Shocking, right? You blew up his house. Where else is he going to go? He's not going to stay there. After tracking him for 2 weeks, the group found Johnson and another gunfight broke out. This time, Johnson shot and killed one constable, which then forced the posse to retreat again. Like, this is like a dozen dudes against one guy. And this one guy is just Ramboing himself out in the Canadian forest, and he's beating them all. Not saying a word either. And as with their other encounters, at this second gunfight, Johnson never said a single word. He's just like, you know, like hiding in the forest, picking dudes off as they're like trying to find him. For round number 5, as they tried to communicate with this guy, the posse recruited several Eskimos, which I don't think you're supposed to say Eskimos anymore. Inuits. I think they're called Inuits now. And they tracked Johnson through the wilderness. The Inuits surmised that Johnson was headed for the Yukon, so the police blocked the only 2 navigable passes through the Richardson Mountains. Johnson, however, he didn't care. He just climbed a 7,000-foot mountain on his own and went around the blockade. He just made his own trail around the police blockade. By now, the posse, who was desperate to find Johnson, hired Wap May, great name, who was a World War I veteran who spent his post-war life flying for Canadian Airways. May buzzed around the mountains and looked for clues, and after 9 days, he figured out what Johnson had been doing. So basically, as Johnson was traveling through the wilderness, he made sure to follow caribou tracks along the Eagle River, which then hid his own footprints from being seen. And since the caribou tracks compacted the snow, Johnson was able to go without snowshoes and cover even more ground than what would normally be possible. With May's help, the posse then tracked down Johnson in 3 days. And when Johnson saw the posse, he started running, but the snow at this point was too deep, and without snowshoes, he wasn't able to get very far. After another brief gunfight, this time Johnson was shot through his pelvis and died. During the course of this chase, Johnson had led the posse over 130 miles from his cabin and had not said a single word to anyone during any of these encounters. At the time of his death, he was carrying over $2,000 in American and Canadian currency, a dead squirrel, and a few teeth with gold fillings. Although Albert Johnson was the name given to this guy, no one is entirely sure who he actually was, where he came from, or if he had anything to do with the original complaint that was filed against him that sent the authorities after him in the first place. All right, the 13th Weird Fun Bag in the books. Let's quickly recap and see what we learned today.
What did we learn?
Number one, it's a real dick move to pay a guy to create a torture device for you and then also make that guy test it out for you on himself. And then to not even kill him with it, but then to just like take him up and kick him off the top of a cliff. Just it's such a dumb story. Number two, Richard Parker, Edgar Allan Poe. Was he a future teller? Did he create what's crazy? Like creates this story of a guy named Richard Parker who dies on a shipwreck. And then 50 years later, a guy named Richard Parker died on a shipwreck in very similar ways. Crazy coincidence. Number two, nope, that was number two. Number three, Albert Johnson led Canadian authorities on a 130-mile chase through the wilderness, finally shot and killed him, and they still weren't exactly sure who he even was to begin with.
What did we learn?
Next week on the show, we are coming back to North Carolina. We're going to have 4 stories from North Carolina history. The first edition was back in episode 206, but we are going to be looking at the stories of John Hall, Robert Harrell, Blanche Taylor Moore, and Peter Stewart Ney. One of those stories is going to horrify you. So which one will it be? You'll find out if you tune in next week. Thank you so much for continuing to listen. Keep telling all your friends and keep it weird.